The blizzard came faster than the weathermen said it would. Winds howled through the Rockies like wolves chasing ghosts, tearing across the open range and burying Elijah Boone's ranch beneath sheets of snow and silence. Out there, 15 miles from the nearest neighbor, he had learned to live with quiet. Prefer it even. Quiet didn't ask questions. Quiet didn't cry in the night. Until that night. It was just past midnight when he heard it barely a sound above the storm, 3 quick knocks against his wooden gate. Not frantic, not weak, but desperate, like the wind itself had brought someone to his door, lantern in hand. Elijah stepped into the storm snow, slapping his face boots, crunching through ice. The gate creaked in the wind, and there, barely visible in the amber glow, 3 small figures huddled under a threadbare quilt. A girl no older than 8, shielding 2 smaller children beneath her. A boy, teeth chattering so hard it sounded like pebbles in a tin can. And the youngest, a little girl with tangled blonde hair, unmoving, her lips a shade of blue no child should ever wear. Elijah's breath caught. He hadn't spoken to another soul in nearly 6 months. Hadn't touched a child since the day he buried his own. But this wasn't something a man could ignore. Not tonight. Not in this cold. He dropped to his knees in the snow, reaching gently for the smallest girl. The older one flinched, arms tightening, eyes wide with fear. "It's all right," Elijah said, his voice rough from disuse. "I won't hurt her." But the girl didn't speak. She just looked at him like a soldier who'd seen too many battles and didn't believe in rescuers anymore. He lifted the little one into his arms. She didn't stir. What Elijah didn't know was that in less than 48 hours, this same child would look into his eyes and call him something he'd long believed, buried forever: Daddy. Elijah Boone hadn't always lived alone. There was a time years ago when the house echoed with laughter and the porch held 2 rocking chairs instead of 1. His wife, Sarah, had filled the cabin with wildflowers and piano music. Their son, Micah, had once drawn stick figures on the barn wall, pretending he was a cowboy guarding the frontier. But that all ended one April morning. A drunk driver, a broken axle, a letter of regret from the sheriff's office, and a funeral that buried both his joy and his reason to keep breathing. After that, Elijah shut the world out, sold his cattle, let the fence rot, let his hair and his beard grow wild. The people of Rock Hollow, a town of maybe 300 souls nestled in the Colorado hills, whispered about the widower up at High Pine Ridge. Some said he'd gone mad. Others said he was just grieving in private. Truth was, Elijah didn't know which he was anymore. So when he brought those children into his home that night, when he laid the smallest girl limp and ice cold on his worn-out couch, he wasn't doing it because he thought he could help. He did it because he couldn't bear the thought of another child dying on his watch. The older girl, Abby, watched him like a hawk, never more than a few feet from her siblings. When he offered her a towel and some soup, she refused both. "I'll feed them," she said flatly. The boy, Noah, barely spoke except to ask in a whisper, "Is Gracie gonna die?" Gracie, that was the little one's name. Elijah examined her carefully. She couldn't have been more than 4. Skin pale, lips purple, shallow breathing. But her heartbeat, though faint, was there. He wrapped her in every blanket he had stoked the fire, even brought out an old quilt Sarah had sewn long ago. He didn't realize until later that his hands had started shaking, not from the cold, but from memory. That night, as Abby and Noah, curled up beside their sister Elijah, sat alone at the kitchen table staring at his calloused hands. He hadn't touched another human being in months, hadn't been needed in years. And now, here were 3 children sleeping under his roof. 3 children who looked like they hadn't known a warm bed in weeks, who flinched at every creak in the floorboards, who didn't ask for help but still showed up anyway. He should have called someone, CPS, maybe the sheriff. But he didn't, Because deep down, Elijah Boone, man of silence, man of ghosts, had already begun to feel something dangerous growing in his chest. Hope. By morning, the storm had passed, but the cold remained sharp enough to bite through leather. Gracie was still asleep, her breathing steadier now, though her skin remained pale. Abby sat at her side, one hand on the little girl's chest, the other clutching a worn, stuffed rabbit with missing eyes. Noah stood by the window, peeking through the curtains, with the quiet alertness of a boy who had learned too young that the world was not safe. Elijah made them breakfast, scrambled eggs, bread with wild honey, and placed the plates on the table without saying a word. He didn't expect a thank you, and none came. Abby only allowed Noah to eat after tasting the food herself. That told Elijah everything he needed to know. They'd been hurt by someone who claimed to care. Mid-morning brought a low rumble in the distance. Elijah stepped out onto the porch, coffee in hand, and saw two vehicles coming up the trail, kicking up snow and gravel. As they climbed toward his ranch, his stomach dropped. The first was a sheriff's department pickup. The second bore the county seal of Child Protective Services. He turned sharply, walking back inside. Abby's head snapped up, eyes wide. "They're here," she whispered. "You knew someone was coming." Abby grabbed Noah's hand. "We don't have time. We need to hide." Elijah hesitated. He didn't know these kids, didn't know if they were telling the truth. But he'd seen bruises on Abby's arm that didn't come from clumsiness. He'd seen the way Noah flinched when a door slammed. And he'd heard Gracie cry out in her sleep, soft, desperate whimpers, like a child trapped in a memory she couldn't escape. "Come with me," he said. He led them down the hall, opened the door to the old bedroom, and pointed beneath the bed. "Get under there, all of you. Don't make a sound." Abby hesitated, holding Gracie tightly. "Please," Elijah said softer now. "Trust me." The front door pounded. "Sheriff's Department, open up." Elijah waited until the children had crawled under the bed and the door was shut. Then he turned and walked to the front room, heart thudding hard beneath his flannel shirt. He opened the door. Sheriff Dalton stood on the porch, his badge catching the morning light. Beside him was Mrs. Whitaker, a tired-looking woman with a clipboard and a too-practiced smile. "Morning, Elijah," the sheriff said. "Sorry to drop in unannounced." Elijah nodded slowly. "What's this about?" "We're looking for 3 missing children," said Mrs. Whitaker. "They disappeared from a foster home south of here 3 days ago. Their names are Abby Noah and Grace Whitman. You haven't seen anything unusual, have you?" Elijah didn't flinch. "Been alone all week." Mrs. Whitaker glanced around him as if trying to peer inside. "Mind if we take a quick look around?" "I do mind," Elijah said, planting his frame firmly in the doorway. "You got a warrant?" "No," Sheriff Dalton replied, clearly uncomfortable. "But if you're not hiding anything, then get one." There was a tense silence. Elijah didn't blink. "We're just trying to help these kids," the social worker said. "Their foster father, Vernon Pike, is worried sick." That name hit Elijah like a gunshot to the spine. Abby had whispered it the night before, curled up by the fire. "He'll come for us." He always does. Vernon Pike. So the abuser had a name, and now a badge and a system backing him. Elijah stared into the sheriff's face. "Sorry I can't help you." Mrs. Whitaker handed him a business card. "If you do see them, call this number. Please." They walked back to their vehicles. As the engines faded, Elijah stood on the porch for a long time, staring at the snow-covered hills, jaw clenched. Inside, Abby slowly emerged from the hallway. She looked at him, eyes brimming, but unbroken. "Thank you," she said, barely a whisper. Elijah said nothing. But in that moment, a line had been crossed. Whatever these children were running from had just found them. And now he was the only thing standing in its way. The snow had stopped falling, but the cold seeped into the bones of the house like an old wound refusing to heal. That night, the children barely touched their dinner. Noah sat hunched over the edge of the couch, hugging his knees. Gracie clung to her rabbit silent, except for a single phrase she repeated like a prayer in her sleep. "Don't let him find us." And Abby, she stared into the fire as if waiting for it to burn away the weight of everything she'd seen. Elijah sat across from her, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He didn't ask questions, not at first. But when she finally spoke, it came not as confession, but as warning. "You don't know what he's capable of." Elijah said nothing, just waited. Abby pulled the sleeves of his old flannel shirt still draped over her small frame up to her elbows. Purple bruises ringed her upper arms. Thin, finger-shaped. "Vernon," she said flatly. "He doesn't hit where people can see. Just enough to make you remember." Elijah's stomach turned. "He tells people he's a hero. Says he's rescued kids from bad homes. Donates to the church bakes pies for fundraisers. Everyone loves him." Her voice grew bitter. "But inside the house, he's different. At night he drinks. Sometimes he'd wake us up just to yell. Or worse." Elijah's grip on the mug tightened. Abby continued, voice growing smaller. "Noah wet the bed once. Vernon made him sleep outside in the shed. Middle of winter, I tried to sneak him a blanket, and Vernon..." She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. I started hiding Gracie under the bed when it got bad. She was too little to understand, but she knew when to be quiet. And that made Vernon even madder. Elijah felt the fire in his gut shift into something else. Rage, yes, but also guilt. For every time he'd looked the other way in his own life. For every child whose cries had been filed away as discipline. Abby looked up at him. "I'm not telling you this so you feel sorry for us. I'm telling you because he's not going to stop. Not until he gets us back." Elijah ran a hand down his face. "How did you get away?" He had to leave town for a few days. "Business trip," he said. Left us with his girlfriend, Monica. She barely noticed us, always high-passed out most of the time. Abby glanced toward her siblings, both finally asleep. I took what food I could find, a few clothes. We ran at night, slept in barns, caves, whatever we could find. She paused. Her eyes shimmered. I knew Gracie was getting sick. But I didn't know what else to do. We were out of food. She had a fever. I was going to try and find help. But then the snow hit. She looked at Elijah now, not as a stranger, but as someone standing at the crossroads of their fate. "If we go back, he'll hurt us again. He might even kill us. Not all at once. Just slowly, until we're too broken to fight." The room fell into silence. The only sound was the fire crackling and the wind whispering outside the windows, like a ghost listening in. Elijah finally spoke, his voice low. "The sheriff thinks Vernon's a saint. So does CPS." Abby nodded. "They always do. He knows how to play people. Mrs. Whitaker, she adores him. Thinks he's God's gift to orphans." Elijah rose and paced toward the window. Outside, the snow gleamed under a pale moon. He could still see the tire tracks where the sheriff's trucks had parked earlier. "Have you ever told anyone before?" he asked. Abby shook her head. "Who would believe us kids don't matter? Not when the adults lie better than we can tell the truth." Her words hit like a slap because they weren't just true for her. They were true for Elijah too. He'd spent years lying to himself. That he was better off alone. That he had nothing left to give. That losing his son meant he could never be a father again. But now in his kitchen sat a little girl who'd carried 2 children through hell. And somehow still had the courage to ask for help. He sat back down, facing her fully. "You did good, Abby," he said. "Getting them out, keeping them safe. You did better than most adults ever could." She blinked, surprised. "I'm not brave." "Yes, you are," Elijah said. "And I'll be damned if I let him undo what you risked everything for." Abby's lip trembled. But she didn't cry. She just nodded once, like a soldier accepting her next command. Elijah looked toward the hallway, where Noah and Gracie slept in the same room his son once had. This wasn't just about shelter anymore. It was about justice. And for the first time in years, Elijah Boone knew exactly what he had to do. They came just before dusk. 6 vehicles rolled up the snowy trail toward Elijah's ranch. 2 sheriff cruisers, a child protective services van, and a sleek black sedan leading the charge like a general heading into battle. Vernon Pike had arrived. Inside the cabin, Abby froze mid-step, eyes wide. Noah whimpered and crawled behind the couch. Gracie clutched her stuffed rabbit, the one with the sewn-on button eye, and whispered, "It's him." Elijah looked out the window, his jaw clenched so tight it hurt. He counted the silhouettes stepping out onto his land, uniformed men with flashlights and gun social workers with clipboards, and at the center of it all, Vernon. The man was dressed in a pressed navy suit, hair silvered just enough to earn trust, eyes too flat to be kind. He walked toward the porch with the confident grace of someone used to getting his way. Elijah opened the door before they could knock. "Mr. Boone," said Mrs. Whitaker, her clipboard clutched like a shield. "We're here to resolve this situation peacefully." Vernon stepped forward, smiling with theatrical concern. "I just want the children to come home safely. They've been through so much already." Elijah stepped out onto the porch, crossing his arms. "They've told me what you've done." Vernon didn't flinch. His smile didn't falter. "Children lie when they're scared," he said smoothly. "Especially troubled ones. Abby has episodes. She's been known to say things that aren't true. Is that so?" Mrs. Whitaker nodded. "It's not uncommon in foster children. Trauma manifests in complex ways." Elijah stared at her. "And bruises, do those lie too?" She hesitated. "Kids often come to foster care with prior injuries. It's difficult to determine when and how." I saw the way Gracie flinched when Vernon's name came up. Elijah interrupted. "I've raised a child. I know fear when I see it." Vernon turned to Mrs. Whitaker with a dramatic sigh. "I'm worried he's become emotionally entangled. It's understandable. Loneliness can do strange things." That did it. From inside the cabin, the door creaked open. Abby stepped out slowly, sleeves rolled to her elbows. "You want proof," she said, her voice shaking. She lifted her shirt and turned her arms outward, finger-shaped bruises still dark and raw. Then she turned and lifted the hem of her sweater, just enough to reveal dark blotches across her ribs. "This is what he does." Silence. Even Sheriff Dalton shifted uncomfortably. Noah stepped out next, his small hand gripping Abby's. "He locked me in the shed." Vernon's mask cracked for a second, just a flicker, but it returned quickly. "These children are traumatized. They're lashing out." He looked to the deputies. "He's harboring minors. This is illegal." Sheriff Dalton opened his mouth to respond, but Vernon raised a folder, documents sealed and stamped. "I have full legal custody, and this man is interfering." Mrs. Whitaker nodded. "Mr. Boone, please surrender the children. The court will review all claims in due time." Elijah looked to the children, Abby shaking but defiant, Noah holding back tears, Gracie barely holding onto her rabbit. And he knew giving them up now meant losing them forever. "No." Mrs. Whitaker's expression hardened. "Then we'll have to remove them by force." Deputy Clark hesitated. "Sir," he said quietly, "don't make this harder than it needs to be." Gracie stepped forward. Her voice barely carried, but it was clear. "I want to stay with Daddy." Vernon flinched. "He's not your father." Gracie looked at him, then back at Elijah. "He feels like one." That stopped everything. Even the wind seemed to hush. But it wasn't enough. Sheriff Dalton gestured. "Deputies, take the children." Abby screamed. Noah burst into tears. Elijah stepped in front of them. Deputy Clark looked torn, genuinely torn, but obeyed. They led the children away, despite Abby's kicking, despite Gracie's cries, despite Elijah's roars. Vernon walked behind them with calm, smug steps. Before he got into the car, he turned to Elijah and said, "You've got a big heart, Boone. Shame you don't understand how the system works." He smiled like the devil himself. Then the doors slammed shut, and they were gone. Elijah stood alone in the snow fist's clenched chest burning, not from cold, but from something far worse. The feeling of failure. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat on his porch with a shotgun across his lap and a rage in his chest that felt too big for his body. Snow had begun to fall again, soft and quiet, mocking almost like the world didn't care what had just happened. But Elijah cared. And by morning, he had a plan. He drove into Rock Hollow just after sunrise, not to the sheriff's office, not to child services. He went to the one place people still whispered the truth when they thought no one was listening. The old feed store run by Hank Broderick. Hank was 70, half-deaf, and suspicious of government men. But he had one thing Elijah needed: history. When Elijah asked if he'd ever heard of Vernon Pike, Hank raised an eyebrow. "Course I have. Slick talker. Foster guy, right? Gave a speech at the town hall last year about second chances." Elijah leaned in. "You ever hear anything?" "Off." Hank took a beat. Then he nodded toward the back room. "You need to talk to May." May was Hank's wife, quiet, sharp-eyed, and more informed than anyone in Rock Hollow. Turns out May used to work at a regional social work office down in Grand Junction. She didn't say much at first. But when Elijah told her the names Abby Noah and Gracie Whitman, her entire face changed. "I remember that file," she said, voice tight. "They came through Grand Junction 6 months ago. Transferred fast. No follow-up check. Vernon Pike filed for emergency placement and got it in under 3 days. That legal? No. But Vernon has friends." May handed Elijah a name: Jill Behrens, a retired CPS investigator who'd filed complaints against Vernon Pike and been silenced. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Back at the ranch, Elijah pulled every connection he had, left an old friend in the county newspaper, a contact with the deputies' union. He sent photos of Abby's bruises, details from May and Vernon's old case number from Jill's notes. Then he waited. 3 days later, the cavalry didn't come, but something better did. Deputy Clark showed up at his gate alone, out of uniform. "I got your message," he said, "and I've been asking questions." Elijah said nothing, just opened the door. Clark took off his hat and lowered his voice. "I think you're right. About Pike. But it has to be airtight. If we're going to stop him, we need more than bruises." Abby had been waiting for this. That evening, with Clark present, she gave her full statement. Dates, names, times, specific incidents, the shed, the bruises. Monica passed out on the couch while Gracie screamed from under a bed. Clark recorded everything. 2 days later, the county called in a third-party investigator. Vernon wasn't notified. The tide had begun to turn. When they came to collect him, Vernon Pike stood on the steps of his polished farmhouse, still in his pressed suit, still smiling, until he saw Deputy Clark and a state investigator behind the wheel. They read him his rights while Mrs. Whitaker stood nearby, stunned. She'd been called to observe. But by the time Abby rolled up her sleeve and showed the bruises again, this time in a courtroom, there wasn't a person in that room who could look away. Vernon's mask didn't crack this time. It shattered. He shouted, swore, blamed the children, blamed the system. Called them liars. Called Elijah a thief, a manipulator. But it was too late. When Abby's testimony was over, the judge didn't just order Vernon detained. He gave Elijah temporary emergency custody. The man who had once buried his entire future in the cold Colorado dirt was now the only safe place for 3 broken children. That night, Elijah stood outside his cabin as the wind died down. No sirens, no snow, just stillness. Inside, Gracie slept curled against his chest. Noah had fallen asleep mid-sentence, clutching a toy Elijah found in the attic. Abby was curled in the chair by the fire, the flame flickering across her healing face. Elijah didn't move, didn't speak. But in his silence, a single truth settled over him. This is what it means to fight. Not with fists, not with fury, but by refusing to look away. 6 months passed. The snow melted. The fences were rebuilt. The ranch that had once stood quiet and forgotten now echoed with something Elijah Boone never thought he'd hear again: laughter. Gracie had started calling him Daddy every morning before breakfast. Not by accident, not by confusion, but by choice. Noah, once silent and nervous, now told endless stories about imaginary coyotes and cowboy adventures, his voice filling the kitchen like music. And Abby, brave, broken, brilliant, Abby had begun drawing again. Her sketches were still in pencil, but they were full of sunlight, rivers, horses, and a man with a weathered face who always stood between the children and the storm. Elijah filed for permanent guardianship. The paperwork was grueling, the hearings long. But this time, the judge looked at more than just documents. He looked at 3 children clinging to the man they called family. He saw the bruises, but more importantly, he saw the healing. And so one Tuesday morning, with Gracie in his lap, Noah at his side, and Abby holding his hand without flinching, Elijah Boone became their father, legally, fully, forever. Vernon Pike was sentenced to 15 years in prison. More children came forward. More truths were spoken. And the system, flawed and blind though it had been, was finally forced to see what it had ignored for too long. But for Elijah, the real victory wasn't in court. It was at the dinner table when Abby passed the potatoes without fear. It was in the barn where Noah learned how to saddle a horse. It was in Gracie's sleepy voice, whispering "Good night, Daddy" every single evening. Because family isn't made by blood. It's made by showing up, by standing in the storm when everyone else walks away. It's made by refusing to let someone stay broken when you know they can be whole again. And for a man who thought his life had ended years ago, Elijah finally understood. Sometimes the storm doesn't come to destroy you. It comes to lead you home. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that no child should ever be left behind, if you believe that family can be chosen and healing is possible, even after all seems lost, then we invite you to subscribe to this channel. Because here at SOTI, Wild West Stories, we tell the stories that still matter, the ones that remind us of who we are and who we could be if we choose compassion over fear and courage over silence. Subscribe now and join us every week for another Wild West tale that just might heal something in you too.